Members of the Pawnee Nation gather in Washington, D.C. to correct an injustice dating back more than a century and a half and reclaim the remains of ancestors.
They were murdered without provocation. They were murdered because they were Indian.
Inside these boxes, the heads of 6 of the Pawnee people who were decapitated by U.S. soldiers in the 1800s. Their skulls got sent to museums in America's capital in the name of U.S. government research. Nearly 30 years ago, James Ridingen had just become a professor at Arizona State University. He came here to Nebraska to tell the story of how Pawnee skulls ended up in museums.
The Army was doing what is referred to as craniometric research, and that's to try to prove the superiority of the white race. They were taking skulls.
They were doing it on orders from the War Department and the U.S. Surgeon General. In this 1868 memo to medical officers, the Surgeon General's office detailed how a collection was commenced last year at the Army Medical Museum, with 47 Indian heads, and the Surgeon General wanted more, to, quote, furnish accurate average measurements of head sizes.
We're freeing the captive spirits of these individuals, putting them back in Mother Earth where they belong.
The story of how many other Native American remains ended up in museums is not nearly as gruesome, but Ridingen still says it was wrong. Human remains were dug up during construction, dam building, roadwork, and archaeological digs, with many items shipped to museums to study. Like at Arizona State University, where Ridingen co-founded the American Indian Studies program. Now in his 80s, he's still fighting to get more museums to return remains that were taken from graves.
Through my citizenship of the Pawnee Nation, I became engaged in repatriation work.
The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, or NAGPRA, is federal law that requires museums and other government agencies to make human remains and cultural objects available to return to tribes. But an investigation from student journalists at Arizona State University's Cronkite News and the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism found unequal compliance by Arizona's 3 largest state universities. The journalist who initiated the team's investigation talks about where it all began.
I'm Indigenous myself. I'm a member of the Navajo Nation. This is our lives. These are our ancestors' lives. That obligation to give back, that's what drives a lot of my own reporting, and especially for this project.
ASU has around 800 human remains and 1,400 cultural objects that the law requires to be made available for return to tribes. But federal records we analyzed show only 2% of what the university holds has been made available for return.
To me, something is wrong. Something is dreadfully wrong.
This is not morally ambiguous. There's nothing to ponder here.
This February, Senator Brian Schatz, a Democrat from Hawaii, told fellow members of Congress universities in particular have moved too slowly.
The fact is, these items do not belong in museums and universities or to science or academia. They belong to the Native people from which they came.
National Park Service records show Northern Arizona University has only a small collection of Indigenous remains and made all of them available for repatriation in 2022. Down in Tucson, on the campus of the University of Arizona, the Arizona State Museum's group of driven but sometimes underfunded staff talked to us about their repatriation work.
These ancestors and their cultural belongings were taken from, communities in the past. And so in order to restore some of that wholeness, they need everyone and everything back.
Their work makes a real impact, like when some of the museum's collection returned to the White Mountain Apache, Ramon Riley's community.
When you go through this process, bringing it back, it makes you feel good, and it makes you feel sad doing it, put in the work.
Riley, 83 years old, has devoted decades of his life to NAGPRA.
Most of the elders have passed on. I'm about the only one that knows about NAGPRA history of Apaches.
For the White Mountain Apache, reburial is a sacred and emotional experience, something Ramon will never forget.
You're going through a process of today would be intergenerational historical trauma. We didn't see a lot of things that happened to our people, but we know the stories. It's still sort of hurtful in a way.
The Arizona State Museum staff has worked hard to repatriate the human remains and artifacts it holds, despite not having enough staff or space.
The primary purpose of our existing process is to make sure that we have everyone and everything that needs to be repatriated go back to the claimant tribe.
ASM has made almost half of its collection available for repatriation, totaling thousands of human remains and tens of thousands of cultural objects.
What's most important is to facilitate repatriation, when in the end all we want to do is do the right thing.
Arizona State University has more work to do. Federal records show the university has made the remains of just 15 humans and only 32 objects from ASU's own collections available for return in the 34 years since NAGPRA became federal law. In an email, a top university official wrote, "While the initial data in your report captures where we are with NAGPRA according to public records, it does not paint a complete picture. There is much work to be done, but we have made great progress and fostered meaningful relationships with tribal partners that are not reflected in the national NAGPRA numbers." The university declined an interview and a request to tour its collection. In an earlier response, the university touted positive changes in recent years, like increases in staff assigned to NAGPRA and more than $500,000 in new funding, some of it from the federal government. The university said it created a handbook with updated NAGPRA protocols, established new NAGPRA programs for students, and said, "We are fully engaged and supportive of the repatriation process and are respectfully fulfilling the tenets of NAGPRA." Records obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request with the National Park Service show ASU acknowledging a range of problems. Staff lost track of human remains and cultural objects that were moved around. Bags containing human bones began to rip, and the then curator of ASU's collection told the federal government in 2020 2 of 4 buildings that housed the collections were in poor condition, and ASU said the collections themselves have not been properly housed for preservation as required by federal standards. The same year, wastewater entered the main collections room of one building and flooded the library. When asked about the details in these records, ASU referred us back to its original response with no new comment. James Wrightington, now a professor emeritus at ASU, wants to see more action.
ASU needs to get off its rear end, needs to do something about this, and soon.